Hey everybody, Wendy Lokanc-Diluzio here once again. In this presentation, I will discuss the policy presentation and final paper for Nursing 5120. I provided the following description in the course outline. For the paper, the purpose is to examine a commonly known practice or policy within your particular healthcare setting. So it is assumed that you would choose a practice or a policy that is somehow related to your scope of practice. In the assignment, you'll analyze the realities and divergences in the evidence for this practice or policy. The paper should be around 8 to 12 pages long, and that excludes your cover page, your references, as well as the appendices if you choose to have some appendices. You should be following APA writing style, and your paper should have a minimum of 12 peer-reviewed scholarly sources, plus additional peer or professional resources. The assignment will consist of an explanation of the practice or policy and the significance of it, an analysis of the strength of the evidence for the practice or policy, identification of the limitations of the evidence for this practice or policy, an analysis of the implications or suggestions for practice. So here are all the components that need to be included in your paper and what each component is worth. So as usual, it's important to start with an introduction that sets the context for what your paper is about. And I'd like to challenge you to create an interesting introduction, an introduction that captures your reader's attention. So that's worth 10%. Next would be an explanation of the practice or policy, as well as its significance. It's important that you provide a link to the practice or policy, or if you can also include it in an appendix, that would be great if possible. And that's worth 15%. So just really talking about why this practice or policy is important. Next would be an analysis of the strengths of the evidence for this practice or policy. And so you don't necessarily only have to look at the evidence cited within the practice or policy, because that might be part of the problem. There isn't enough evidence cited, or maybe depending on whoever's written it or the style of writing it, they might not have a comprehensive list of references or citations. And the other thing to think about is, these policies take a long time to write. They take a long time to get approved. The minute that they're published, they're practically out of date because there's more research or more literature that could be out there to support or not support the practice or policy. So feel free to look outside of whatever's been cited as evidence, because that might be another argument as well as to why there's this evidence or this practice or policy is strong, because even the most current literature or evidence supports it. Also discuss or analyze the limitations of the evidence. So same thing. I'm guessing that in these policies or practices, whoever wrote them, they're not going to include the limitations of the evidence, or they're not going to include evidence that contradicts what the policy or practice is. So it's important that you also look for evidence that contradicts the evidence that was included, or include the evidence that contradicts what's in the practice or policy. I hope that makes sense. Also, I'd like you to analyze the implications for nursing practice as art and science, as well as provide suggestions for nursing practice as art and science based on your policy or practice that you chose. And so something that, we've talked a lot about in this course is the importance of evidence-based practice and looking at the science part of nursing and how we need the science to guide our practice. But I'd also like you to think about these policies or practices and the art component as well, if it applies. And I guess what I'm thinking is, in last semester, I believe it was in the ethics class, some of the students in our class talked about maid or medical assistants in dying, the policy where I believe in 2024, they're allowing people with mental illness to have that as an option. And I guess, for myself, and you'd have to be 18 years age or older. I guess for myself as a parent, let's say my child or children end up suffering from mental illness, and let's say they're 20 or 22, 23, I would be devastated. So I would think that's where the art piece applies as well. I hope that this makes sense. I apologize if it doesn't. I'd like you to use a minimum of 12 sources. And then, of course, it's important, that you have proper spelling, grammar, APA, the flow and organization of the paper is important, like it makes sense, as well as the use of headings to organize your paper. I believe most of you in previous papers have used headings, but I know in other classes, some people don't necessarily use the headings, and it's very difficult for me to mark it, and it takes a lot longer, and sometimes I don't give you credit for something because I just don't see how it might relate to what the guidelines are of the paper. So if you can use headings to organize your paper, that would be great. And then finally, please include a conclusion which summarizes the key points of the paper. And once again, do your best to make it interesting. So I just want to give you a quick APA reference citing tip. I think a lot of you use the reference management systems, which also help with having correct citations. But for those of you that don't have the reference management system, something that has saved me a lot of time is if you go into Google Scholar and you type in the name of your article, and then you press the cite button, and I have the yellow arrow pointing to it, then your citation will come up. Okay, so here's what comes up when you press the cite button in Google Scholar. And so if you're publishing a paper in the future and they want you to use a different type of citation system, so MLA or Chicago, for example, if you press the cite button, you have all different versions. And it should give you the correct way of citing your reference. Now, sometimes they mess up as well, so you have to double check. In terms of the presentation will offer you the opportunity to share your clinical practice or policy with your group and facilitate a conversation, which helps provide you with some insights for your final paper. So, I want a brief discussion or a brief explanation of the practice or policy and the significance. So you're going to see that what you do for this presentation is going to be some initial work that you can use for your final paper. I'd also like you to include a brief analysis of the strengths and the limitations of the evidence for this practice and policy, as well as a brief analysis of the implications or suggestions for practice. And those pieces are each worth 20%. Next, it's also important that you have the opportunity to engage your classmates and discuss or ask for your peers' opinions or their insights. So I'd like to see that you're using strategies to engage your colleagues so that they can provide you some feedback. So that piece is worth 10%. Please use a minimum of 5 sources, and of course cite using APA style. And again, your final paper, I said 12 sources. This one is just, again, so you have the opportunity to do some work ahead of time and just see, what the literature is saying in terms of your policy or practice. The next piece, which is worth 20%, is organization. So in the last presentation, it was more of a participation type of activity. This time around, it's, I'm going to be pickier with the marking. And so it's important. I would suggest that you use PowerPoint for this presentation. It's important to have your title slide, and it should have your name on it and the name of your presentation. And then, an introduction slide or a slide that says, what people should expect in your presentation. You should have a conclusion slide as well. And of course, it should be free of grammar and spelling errors. It's important that your thoughts are organized and professionally communicated in an interesting and creative way. Something else that I haven't been picky on in the past, but I am going to look at this time, is font size. So using an appropriate font size so that it's easy to read. And there are guidelines for PowerPoint that, depending on the type of font you use, it should be at least, I think, 18 or 20 or higher, something like that. It's also important that you use colors that are appropriate so that it's easy to read the writing. Something that I've always been told, especially for people that have different types of seeing difficulties, is not to use a red font, because it's really hard for people to see. And then it's important as well that your slides are not too text dense. So you're not writing in terms of big paragraphs on each slide, making a few key points and then speaking to them. And then, use your images, just like you did in the last presentation. A lot of you did these beautiful slides with these beautiful images with beautiful colors, just to make your slides visually appealing. As well, I'm going to be, timing the presentation. So because on March 27th, we have way more people presenting, it's about 15 to 17 minutes of presenting per person. And then on March 28th, it's about 15 to 20 minutes of presenting. And you may choose to incorporate discussion throughout your presentation, or you may choose to just ask people to consider some of the questions or consider some of the feedback, and then you discuss the feedback at the end. And so something else I would suggest is that if people are giving you feedback or providing their own insights, that you take notes on it as well, so that you can include some of the points that your peers are going to be making in your final paper. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. You all have my email address as well as my cell phone number. If you want to meet and have a discussion, I'm up for that as well. Or if you have a quick question by text, feel free to ask your question that way as well. I think the key at this point is just figuring out which policy or practice that you're going to be using. And something that I think you've heard me say a lot is choose something that is straightforward, because even if it's straightforward, when it comes time to write, it's not going to be straightforward and it's not going to be easy. And the other thing is just try not to overthink it. Try not to make it so complicated for yourself. You're all excellent, very strong writers and, excellent critical thinkers. So, just have faith in your abilities at this point is what I would say.